So welcome to one of the most important lectures of the entire year. Today's lecture is super important, so please make sure that you are trying your absolute best. It's going to be a little bit long. You can think of this almost as a homework assignment to the rest if it goes a little bit too long. Hopefully I'll be able to do this all in one sitting, but I'm buying a house today, and so I have to leave in an hour. So if I don't get it done in an hour, this might be a two-parter that I will provide for you at some time, but I'll send out a message if that happens. So today's notes, there's a couple of different things that we're going to do. So we actually are going to have to go back just a little bit and cover a topic that we didn't necessarily talk about previously. And so what I need you to get out for me really quickly is going to be your notes called The Old West and Indian Wars. These are the ones that also had populism. It was a packet. It's cow notes on the front, and then it has Wizard of Oz towards the end. So it's a packet that has the two. And on the very last page at the very bottom, we're going to be talking about one of the topics which has to do with what's called the New South. And it's really a post-Reconstruction era of the South, and we're going to really be focusing on, in particular, African Americans during this time. Now, this is the section, by the way, that you're looking for. On your train notes, there is another section that's actually the old section. I should have deleted it off of, but this is what you should be looking at are going to be these ones that are going to be right here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context really quickly for the New South. So the New South is going to be right at the end of Reconstruction, and this is really in that Redemption era. So if you guys remember when we talked about the three phases of Reconstruction, this is really when the South wants to redeem themselves from the loss after the Civil War. And looking into context again, we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, which were amendments that guaranteed the right to vote. However, not only did they guarantee these rights, but they also really angered the Southerners who did not want African Americans and black people in the United States to gain those rights. So the New South begins, and it's basically this ideology by the elite Southerners, and this is a STAR term, by the way. It has its own key concepts, so it's really important to be able to remember. And this is the ideology by elite Southerners in the South that has three major parts. The very first is this nostalgia of plantation and slavery life. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment of how that kind of ended, but the New South technically ends that time period of redemption. It also begins the economic development of the South, but really when it gets really intense, it's going to be the promotion of racial segregation from the North with Jim Crow laws. So this is what the South is. So this is like America's population and things like that. And if you notice, we talked about before how our major populations are in the North. And if you notice, we have a lot of sparsity in our population that's going to be in the South. Now, in particular, notice in these two images also the distribution of wealth. So notice the population in the North is also where the wealth is in the North as well, with the South being in poverty. And again, we talked about populism and different things like that, but now we're going to talk about really the impact of that on the economy and the politics of the South. First, we have to know what's called the lost cause idea. And this was this pre-Civil War nostalgia. There was a very chivalrous past. And this is the idea of the Southern gentleman and a lot of the Southern mentalities. Now, the lost cause theory is really well seen in a movie called Gone with the Wind. So in the movie Gone with the Wind, you have this woman who is lives on a plantation. She's actually only supposed to be 16 years old in this image. And she has a slave, and she names the slave Mammy. Now, when this movie was created in the 1920s and 30s, the woman who played Mammy, she was actually one of the very first women to be escalated to possibly receive awards from this, but she received a lot of racism. She wasn't allowed to enter the same rooms as people who were white. She wasn't allowed to eat at the same tables with people who are white. And throughout the movie, she ends up basically calling her slave Mammy nonstop, so not even by her name. And that actually portrayed the Mammy idea and the Mammy stereotype all throughout the Black legacy that actually continues up until today, that we still see these racisms and the use of the word Mammy to refer to black people in the United States today. Now, this also created the idea of the Southern belle and the Southern gentleman. Is this mentality of like remembering the South and remembering what once was. And that's really the emphasis of the lost cause theory. Now, this movie, by the way, it's very interesting because ever since, especially Black Lives Matter and things like that, it's really come under a lot of controversy, and people have begun to say that we shouldn't watch these movies. It's been banned in a lot of libraries, for example, of having that lost cause nostalgia. Now, during this time period as well, you have Plessy v. Ferguson, which is like a double-star term. It's extremely important. It used to be, it was on every single AP exam. But Plessy v. Ferguson is one of the most influential Supreme Court cases, similar to the Dred Scott decision, where it's a really horrible thing that happened and a really bad decision by the American government. So if you guys remember, we have this thing called the 14th Amendment. That's the HC of Plessy v. Ferguson. And remember, that guaranteed citizenship to anybody born in the United States, in this case, Black Americans. And it also created the Equal Protection Clause, which is that same clause that applied with the gay marriage ruling, which says that no matter what the state you're in, you have equal protection under the laws. Well, what happened is that there was a lot of segregation. Remember, Jim Crow laws, you can also put an HC of this, would be Jim Crow laws, that separated between black and white. Well, what happened is that there was this big debate over whether or not it is actually equal from the equal protection laws to have this segregation, which leads us to Plessy v. Ferguson. So there's going to be this guy named Plessy. Now, interesting fact, if you Google Homer Plessy or Plessy v. Ferguson, this is the guy that pops up. This is actually not Plessy. This is somebody completely different. We're going to use him in this because if you Google, you're going to see him. It's actually not Plessy v. Ferguson. It's a really interesting thing where it's perpetuated that it is. It's actually not him. And he was black, but he was, I believe it was a quarter or so, or half black. And so he was very, very light-skinned. And it was really interesting because he could pass as somebody who was white, and he dealt with that his whole life. And he wanted to test this idea of the Equal Protection Clause, of whether or not he could go in and, as somebody who's black, who was extremely wealthy, actually, very prominent, could he break these laws? So he purposely buys a first-class ticket in the white passenger car. There was no first class for people who are black. He buys a first-class ticket knowing he's breaking the law, and he's going to go in, he's going to test this because trains were interstate commerce. It's a federal issue, not a state issue. And so he goes into this, and basically he's in this car, and at the time there was a separate car called the Jim Crow car, which is where if you were black, that's where you were. It was really uncomfortable, really awful, and really terrible. And so he purposely goes into the first-class car to test if they're going to kick him off. They do kick him off. He specifically sues. Again, this was all planned out to see whether or not the Equal Protection Clause would or would not apply, saying, is it possible to be able to have equal rights among all and segregation? Well, what ends up happening is that they come up with this Plessy v. Ferguson idea, which is the idea of separate but equal. So if you want to star that, that's the actual term from the Supreme Court case. Separate but equal basically is the idea that we're giving you equality. It's just we're going to give you separate equality. So for example, both of these people in this image, they both have water. One's just really better than the other. A great example that I saw a couple of years ago that I really enjoyed had to do with this idea of separate but equal, and it was trying to show you this in a quiz bowl. So there was a quiz bowl, and they had two groups of kids, and they were separated by a partition. And one side of the kids, they all got computers, and the other side of the kids got textbooks and encyclopedias. So then what they did is they said, go, here's the question, who gets it right? And obviously the kids with the computers continue to get it right. Did they both have the opportunity to answer the questions? Yes. Were they both given resources? Yes. They were just separate resources. So separate but equal is the idea that it basically, if you want to write next to separate but equal, it legally established racism and segregation in the United States. Now, what basically ends up happening is that this pretty much sets an establishment where people who are black are less than others based on legality due to Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, interesting idea is the actual original train car that Plessy v. Ferguson this whole incident happened in. It was kept for a really long time in a train museum, and then they were liquidating. And so what happened is that they actually put this in the African American Smithsonian, which is in Washington, D.C. And so if you ever go, you can go and see the car that Plessy v. Ferguson was in. Another interesting thing, too, that happens during this Lost Cause Southern era as well has to do with the establishment of the chain gangs. So what happens is that black Americans are put onto these chain gangs where there's all conjoined by a chain, and then they go and work on the fields and different things like that. So again, the separate but equal idea of you're both getting equal punishment, just one of yours is worse and separate. Now, in terms of overall with the New South and things like that, the only other thing that I would make sure to put down is in the New South, one of the most important things that happens to the economy is the industrialization of the South. It really begins to grow the industry in the South, but again, a lot of that is played by African American sharecropping as well as other discriminatory things. So what happens is African Americans begin to respond to the New South, respond to this nostalgia and different things like that. Although the nostalgia tries to begin to end, but if you guys remember, we had that discussion on Civil War monuments. Most of those actually come in the Lost Cause era. Interesting fact. So what happens is that African Americans are going to begin to respond to all of this discrimination and unjust things happening in the United States. One of these things is what's called the establishment of the NAACP. So the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Still exists today, and their entire goal is to restore African American political and social rights. So the NAACP is going to attempt to be able to improve society and improve what's going on in the United States. One of the biggest things that they wanted to bring awareness to, it has to do with what is called lynching. Now, I'm giving you a quick warning. These are going to be extremely graphic photos. If you want to look away, you can just listen and things like that to get the information that you need to know. But these are extremely graphic photos that you're about to look at. So lynching is basically when a group of people take the law into their own hands, or they're going to execute the law into their own hands. And one of the things that happens with this is where you get the image of the noose. So what happens is that if you decide that somebody else has done something wrong, you are going to take the matter into your own hands. So oftentimes these would be blatant accusations that were just not true. Most of these had to do with sexuality. A lot of accusations of rape, for example. You could even just look at a white woman and you could be arrested and lynched. And what would happen is these people would get arrested, and then the mob would come in, go into the jail without any resistance at all, take the person, and then lynch and hang them. Now, it depends on the situation of how violent that this would get. So you can see in this case scenario is going to be somebody who was burnt as well, torturing and different things like that. And I just want you to think really quickly and look at the background of this picture. What are the people watching this acting like? And one thing that you're going to notice is just a general continuity of the time is that this was all normal to people. This was something that you went and did. Was lynching illegal? Sure. Did anybody care about it? No, not at all. Now, this could be for any race, and here in Utah, for example, we had some lynching incidents with people who were Chinese, in particular due to the Transcontinental Railroad and especially towards Ogden. But I want to point this out specifically because with lynching, yes, you could reference the other ones, but it's really become symbolic of Black Americans in the United States, are these mass lynchings and deaths. In fact, it got so common that you could actually go to the grocery store and buy postcards like this. So imagine sending it to your friend and saying, hey, how are you doing? How's everything going? Oh, by the way, here's a picture of lynching. Notice, by the way, that you have this warning right here. So this is trying to warn Black Americans not to come into the South, or else bad things could end up happening to them. And this just becomes completely symbolic of the time period of this lynching and this awfulness of these mass mobs. One thing to note, by the way, before I continue on, I just want to give you another example. If you've ever seen the movie Holes, and you know in that section where the person who's Black has a relationship with the girl who's white, and they kiss each other, and then there's a really famous incident where her school is burned down, and then she says, I kissed him too, so you'll have to hang me too. And the guy responds, and he says, it's not illegal for you to do it, it's only illegal for him to do it. And he was lynched in that movie as well. Now, one thing I want to note as well, is just about lynching as a general whole. Lynching is awful and absolutely terrible. With these lynchings that happened, they were all over the place and they were extremely commonplace. And this is part of the reason why the noose is so symbolic of Black lynching. Every year there is somebody who wears a noose to Halloween or something like that. There was a super famous incident nearby, and I know that this was a former Skyline student's parents that did this. But there was a really famous incident a couple years ago where somebody had a noose hanging and a Black body hanging in their tree, and it became a huge issue. It went viral over that as well with lynching. And so the NAACP wants to get rid of that. That's their original establishment, is they want to be able to create anti-lynching bills and get rid of all these issues in the United States and bring awareness to lynching and make it stop. Now, in terms of lynching, you can see that the Deep South had the most amounts of lynching, in particular in certain areas. Arkansas was one of the most popular as well. So the NAACP gets created in order to be able to help these Black Americans, and it continues up until today. The NAACP is still around. There was actually a really famous incident as well, and I like to bring this up because a lot of students ask me about it, where this person who was white, who this is her on the left, she became one of the leaders in the NAACP. I think it was in Washington. This is her on the right, and you might say those look nothing alike. She began to impersonate, and she took on the embodiment of somebody who's Black. She said she identified mentally as Black, and she rose to the head of the NAACP until her entire thing was exposed, actually by her parents, that she wasn't Black at all. Now, one thing too, I think I have it in another actually, let me get to this first. We already talked about that. One thing I just want to point out again, like we talked about before, is sharecropping. Just remember that sharecropping is exponential in the South. Lots of Black Americans, but you could also be white and sharecrop too. So you need to get your new notes out. It looks like this. If you are 1A, I gave you the wrong one. So please make sure that you have this new option, which you should have come and picked up. But if not, just make sure if it doesn't have this thing at the top, then you have the wrong edition of these notes. Now, one thing I want to point out really quickly as we go through this, we're prepping for the DBQ next class period, so I have to select certain things that we're actually going to talk about in class. Everything else is going to be a supplemental lecture homework assignment, and I will film that as soon as I can, that you'll have the next 1.5 weeks to be able to do. But we're going to focus specifically on the things you need to know for the DBQ. Now, we're entering into this time period known as the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era, by the way, is one of my favorite time periods. It actually is my favorite time period. I love this time period because the progressive movement is all about different movements and organizations trying to improve society economically, socially, and politically. And these reformers wanted to be able to eliminate and harness the power of the federal government, and not just using it for their own and advocating, but really advocating for change at a nationwide level for all these different issues. If you think about current things such as the Me Too movement, the BLM movement, anything having to do with trying to be able to make change at the federal level, whether you agree or disagree with it, is a very similar modern day progressive era. And I think especially since, really it started with George Floyd, is ever since that time, I think there's been a really big rise of movements, not just in those movements at all, but all across the United States, like the Underground Railroad, for example, that I've been trying to change at the federal level. And that's the same thing as the progressive era. So a lot of people today would say that we're in a modern day progressive era. So we're going to focus on the progressive era stuff that you need to know for the DBQ starting next class. So since we just barely talked about African Americans, let's continue that. So on your paper, you need to go over to the right-hand side with African Americans. We'll cover these in a supplemental lecture. So Ida B. Wells, she hears all about these issues. Oh, and by the way, real quick, this packet is a must-know packet. It's one of the most important packets in notes. So make sure that you keep this 1,000-star. It's going to have at least 3 to 4 stimulus sets. Please make sure that you know this. So Ida B. Wells, she knows about these things with lynching, and she wants to be able to expose lynching. And so she becomes an American journalist that's going to really focus on anti-lynching campaigns and anti-lynching lectures, books, and different things like that. At the same time, you're going to have a guy named Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington, by the way, you're filling in the blanks, if you didn't know that. So Booker T. Washington, he is going to kind of be, if you want to put next to Booker T. Washington, I wouldn't call him an outcast. I would consider him an other to a lot of people. When you look at different perceptions of progressive era movements for Black Americans at this time, Booker T. Washington is the other of this. What I mean by that is all these other journalists, and you can even put this like in the margins or something, everybody but Booker T. Washington really focused on change, improvement, equal rights. Booker T. Washington was under the impression that trying to advocate for that is just going to cause more violence and more death of Black Americans. So instead, the idea would be to accept your current status, and you can accept segregation or however you want to deem it, and instead work to gain economic opportunities as well as education. So it wasn't necessarily to end segregation, it was instead to focus on other things that he felt like would be more obtainable through the federal government. So he's kind of the other of this, and it's really interesting because he's not talked about a lot because of the fact that he had a different impression of the movement in this era. Now, the Niagara movement was actually the opposite of this. So when they heard Booker T. Washington, who is quite famous, they began to instead do what's called the Niagara movement, which was helped sponsored by the NAACP. And the entire idea of the NAACP, or the Niagara movement, was again to move away from accommodating, so where white Americans accommodate Black Americans, and instead pushing for full equality. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois during this time, he's also pretty heavy. He's going to create several different legislative reform movements, and he specifically is going to work with the NAACP in order to be able to help African Americans in the United States. So that's going to end us with the NAACP, which I've already talked about previously. Now, I want to mention one thing really quickly that I just noticed that we really need to focus on. When students talk about the NAACP, they start to use really poor verbiage when they refer to Black Americans or African Americans. Last year, there was a question that had the NAACP on it, and I had several people use the word colored Americans or colored people, or referring to people who are Black as colored. Just be aware that the better term would be to use Black. So rather than saying the NAACP helped colored people, which is what we see a lot of times, it's really bad verbiage, and it's really not using historical context very well. Instead, just use Black Americans or African Americans, Black Americans, the more preferable, but each of them work just fine. So they really worked to try to be able to establish discrimination and gain civil rights. But really the biggest things that I would know for NAACP, if you want to start that last bullet, is that they struggled to gain many freedoms and continued to deal with discrimination. While they advocated for a lot of things, they weren't very successful. However, one of the most important successful things that they did, if you want to highlight, is declaring the grandfather clauses unconstitutional. So basically what there was a grandfather clause. So if you guys remember, there's voting rights and stuff like that. So in theory, the 15th Amendment, everybody should have the right to vote. However, that didn't obviously happen. The government still said you couldn't vote, and one of the ways they did this was through the grandfather clause. So instead of saying that if you're Black you can't vote, they would instead say if your grandfather didn't vote, then you can't vote. Well, who were the grandparents? The slaves. And so because of that, people were disenfranchised, which means not allowed to vote, even though they should have been able to vote. But one of the things they did do is the Supreme Court did eventually declare the grandfather clause unconstitutional, and you could put above this was their most successful during this time period. So with African American rights, the people that you more than likely need to know the most, I would know Booker T. Washington, and specifically that he had a contrasting opinion. I would know Ida B. Wells for lynching, and make sure you highlight lynching on that as well. And then star the NAACP, which is the most important in here as well. So notice, for example, we're talking about people trying to be able to make progress. Ida B. Wells was successful in showing people about lynching. The anti-lynching laws, though, just don't come until a little bit later. So now we're going to skip ahead. So we're going to skip the next section, which is one of my favorite sections, but we'll do it later. And we're going to move on to prohibition. So now what's going to happen is we're going to really focus on prohibition and temperance, which you should automatically know is going to be the banning of alcohol. So prohibition in itself, if you want to start this, is going to be the movement to prevent the sale and the consumption of alcohol. Now, if you want to underline the word prohibit, that's really what you need to know for this. The reason I say that is we have another word called temperance. Temperance is different. Temperance is the idea of abstaining from alcohol as well as advocating for the use of what's called, if you want to highlight, a dry law, which is making it so that alcohol is banned in the area. However, prohibition is the actual prohibiting. So temperance is advocating, prohibition is the actual prohibiting. So let's talk about prohibition, and we're going to actually talk about this twice, one in the 1920s and one right now. So what's going to happen is that they want to be able to prohibit and stop the sale of alcohol. And we've talked about this previously, but this is really when it begins to escalate. So what you can see right here is you can see that you have the devil's toboggan. So first you start to go and drink just at the local hotel or drugstore, and then you start to move further and further, and eventually you go to hell and you gamble, and eventually you're in a drunkard's grave because you die. And this is trying to convince you not to drink alcohol. And so the whole goal was to be able to create what were called dry laws, which is the idea that you can't drink alcohol in a certain area. Let me give you some perspective. So if you choose to go to a university and college, you're going to want to make sure you know if they are a wet or a dry school. Schools like, for example, Utah State are dry schools, whereas other schools like I think UVU is a wet school are some examples. And that means whether or not you can or cannot have alcohol on campus. So when you go to Utah State, if you have alcohol and you are on campus, you can be expelled from the school, for example. And some people choose to go to dry schools, and some people specifically choose to go to wet schools for those same reasons. But basically the whole idea was to be able to ban alcohol. And here in Utah, there was quite a few that were really popular. There are also some ways that you can ban alcohol without banning alcohol. So a really great example of that is Logan, for example. Logan has an actual restriction on the amount of bars that they can have. I believe Logan can only have can't have any standalone bars, but can have bars like, for example, places can serve alcohol. So North Logan, I think, can only have 5 bars according to state law of business licenses. And so there's ways to be able to do it. Here in Utah, we had this really famous thing called the alcoholic veil. And the whole idea was for a long time, we had a law up until I think 2 years ago that said if you wanted to serve alcohol at like a venue, it had to be where a partition where you couldn't see the alcohol. So like I would go to the Eccles Theater and there would be an area with alcohol and they would have windows that were frosted so that you couldn't actually see the alcohol inside it. Those are all temperance and dry law type of things. And the whole idea again was avoiding that drunkard's grave. How can you be able to convince people to stop? So there was this really famous thing where people would go into saloons who were, pro-prohibition and pro-dry laws, and they would actually take the saloon owners out to the graveyards and point and say, this guy died of alcohol, and this guy died of alcohol, and this guy died of alcohol. And really where this prohibition and temperance comes from, again, we talked about before, is the rise of violence in the United States, and it really finishes due to World War I, but we're going to more talk about that in just a little bit, or a couple of weeks from now. And so the whole idea, too, is trying to be able to avoid this. Also, you can put next to prohibition, you can also put... so with your prohibition here is the movement to prevent the consumption of alcohol, if you didn't know. You can also put next to this too, this was also a really good thing for nativism, especially against Germans and Irish. So this was another great way to be able to prove again that Irish and German were less. And so they tried to be able to start to create these dry laws, and one of the very first places where they started to do this is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And if you want to highlight that, that's a really common, you also see WCTU, the acronym of that too, and they're going to spread the gospel of temperance all around the world. And so what you would do is they started with these pledges. So what you would do is you would make this pledge and you'd say, I solemnly swear that I will never drink alcohol. And then this, you would sign up for it and you would make this pledge that you promise that you wouldn't do it. And so what happened is that this Women's Christian Temperance Union just like went crazy and was getting rid of all the alcohol and advocating for these dry laws. And it was a really great way for women to be able to be supporters of reform movements. One thing overall, and if you just want to put it in the bottom, wherever you want to put it, is a consistency that there was two major groups of people who did movements to help people, the wealthy, which we'll talk about later, but especially women, middle and upper class. And it's because they were trying to get rid of these social evils, and in particularly the middle class females, because they saw those evils on a daily basis. And so this is one of my favorite political cartoons. I just love her coming in here and destroying all the alcohol, and you can see that she has the poor baby and she's trying to stop the snake of alcohol. And so you start to have this big debate over wet or dry. I love this one of who gets your vote, your mother, so your mother who wants temperance, or the saloon to vote dry. And in several states, they were able to successfully lobby for wet and dry laws. Now, something that is absolutely one of my favorite things is this lady named Carrie Nation, and she's a great term to be able to throw into an AP exam essay. So Carrie Nation was this woman, and she was a nun. She had actually grown up with a very abusive husband, very physically abusive husband, who was very into alcohol and died of alcoholism. Following that, she converted to be a nun, but she was very famous for how she got rid of the alcohol in the United States. So what she did is she would go into bars and she would take her little hatchet and the Bible. And so she would go into bars and she would basically destroy the entire thing, and people would just like ransack, causing what they estimate to be millions of dollars of alcohol damage and bar damage to try to get rid of this. And she became the absolute like synonymous thing with temperance, of making the more dry laws and preventing people from consuming alcohol. Now, Carrie Nation was arrested many times, but she had a lot of wealth. She just bailed herself out. And her famous phrase, when they would ask her, did you do it? She would say, I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my little hatchet. And that was the famous phrase that she said as well. Also, a couple of years ago, a student sent me this, and I just love this idea, is again, Carrie Nation coming in and stopping all the alcohol. Now, something extremely important here is to make sure that you write in prohibition in here. So I would make sure to highlight the word temperance and Women's Christian Temperance Union. Carrie Nation's are really easy to remember. Make sure you put next to this, they did not prohibit the sale of alcohol until 1920. That's extremely important. So please make sure that you note that down. And the reason I say that is because we always have people that write down that alcohol was banned. The Progressive era, it was not. They did, laws like dry laws and things like that, but it was not nationwide banned until after the Progressive era and after World War I. So if you get a prompt, make sure you don't write it was prohibited nationwide. It was only in individual states. Now, social welfare reform, we're not going to spend hardly any time. It's just we've already talked about it, and I want to make sure you add it to your notes. So John Dewey, he had this really big thing where he was emphasizing the idea that education should be for all. And so he started to spread free public education, for example. And then he also he was really into learning by doing. So rather than just learning math equations, you would learn math equations to help you solve a problem in real life. So building some sort of a house, and you would have to do math to be able to figure that out. And then Jane Addams, we already know, very, very important. Make sure to highlight and star Jane Addams in the settlement houses as a whole. Make sure you know Jane Addams, too, was in several different ideas and several different topics. All right, so heading into the next one, we're heading into the next page, and we're heading into the muckrakers and the journalism. So heading into the muckrakers, what you need to know. So muckrakers are going to be journalists that they want to be able to expose and find the muck. And so their entire idea is that they are going to rake through the muck and the terribleness of these businesses, and they're going to expose them. So I relate this really similarly to like a modern day exposer. A couple years ago, for example, there was a guy that would be a muckraker he was a former Trump aide, and he made this book, and then it allegedly exposed secrets, but then somebody came out and said those secrets weren't at all what was true. You could have something like PETA would be a muckraker, where they attempt to go and use journalism and investigative journalism and try to expose the secrets of different things. There's all these different ways, but anybody who tries to like film something or write something to expose things, that's a muckraker. And this is the most common one, which the meat scandal we're going to talk about in just a moment. But these are these journalisms that are going to investigate and find the muck. They rake through the scandal and the robber barons and the industrialists to expose what was underneath. Now let's talk about some of these muckrakers. And by the way, I would just star this entire section. You need to know every single one of these terms. I would highlight the muckrakers, and then the most important ones that you're probably going to hear that you can star is Ida Tarbell, Jacob Riis, and Upton Sinclair are going to be the most common, as well as Lincoln Steffens, which is actually in your far right column at the very top. So Frank Norris is going to be one of the very first muckrakers, and he's looking into the railroads. If you guys remember, we talked about populism and things like that, and we talked about how you have this idea of the octopus, and this is a funny one with Verizon, for example, that you're seeing here. If you guys remember the octopus as a whole, but the octopus in this case is not Standard Oil. It is instead going to be the railroads. So what he does is he did this octopus, and it's this allegory of an octopus taking over, and the octopus is the railroads crisscrossing around, trying to expose the issues with the railroad companies. We've already talked about Ida Tarbell, so I'm not going to extensively talk about her. She was the one that exposed the Standard Oil Company and eventually led him to sell his business and retire. And then this is one of the images that comes from it, so you can see that you have Rockefeller right here, and then you have all the railroads right here, and it's talking about him taking up all the different industries in order to get the oil. We've also already talked about Jacob Riis and how the other half lives. This is where he's going to expose the life of immigrants in tenements, which we've already discussed previously. Now, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, you should have done as your homework. However, I kind of kept forgetting to tell the in-person students. So if you're an in-person student, you can pause the video and do this in just a second. But you've already read, in theory, The Jungle. And this was trying to introduce you to this investigative journalism. So Upton Sinclair, he went behind the scenes of a meatpacking company. And what he did is he basically was employed there. He pretended to be an applicant, but then every day he was collecting evidence about how horrible these meatpacking companies is. So if you haven't read it, go ahead and stop right now and do that activity and come back, because I'd rather you do that first. So go ahead and do that. So now that you've done that, I want you to think, how bad was it? It was pretty bad. A lot of people, when I ask them what was the worst things you read, they talk about the fingers getting lost and the guy that died and it now becomes lard, and there's bones in the lard and people being burned alive and stuff like that. And that was all just normal in the meatpacking. That's what you were eating. The sausage is usually what most people are the most upset about when they think like stomach-wise, ew. And that was all what you were eating every single day. And so it was a really big problem because all these people were eating this just like unsafe stuff from the meatpacking industry and different things like that. So now let's head into consumer and business reform, because what happens is that these different books are going to come out and they want to change things. And so what's going to happen is things are going to change for the consumer. The first thing that happens from the books such as So like Arda Tarbell and the Octopus, those more are trust stuff that we'll talk about a little bit later. But Upton Sinclair's The Jungle immediately led to reform. One of those reforms was the Meat Inspection Act, which is going to be a federal act that's going to require that you are going to have to check all the food to make sure that it's actually safe. And so inspectors started to come and they started to realize all these horrible, terrible conditions, and they started to improve food compliance as well as food quality in the United States. Now, another thing that happens too immediately afterward, which is one that a lot of you guys are probably thankful for, is what's called the Pure Food and Drug Act. So the Pure Food and Drug Act forbids any sort of false advertising, and you have to have honest food labels and advertisements. So this is where you get, for example, like a company can't say you're going to lose 10 pounds in 2 weeks unless they can back that up with actual facts. They can't just claim something it is what it isn't. So, for example, if I am drinking, like, for example, an apple juice, it has to say how much apple juice is it? Is it real apple juice? Is it fake? All of that is due to the Pure Food and Drug Act. And a lot of this has to do with just really incorrect, exaggerated advertisements to get you to buy their product. So you can see, if you buy this product, your hair will be this long. Or this is Pond's Extract, which is from the best athletes. Think of it, it's not steroids, but think of it as a similar idea of what it did to you. If you take this Pond's Extract, in this case, cancer can be cured with oil. So if you rub oil on somebody and then the doctor can look at the oil and he can see through it. Also, cancer can be proved by reading a book. And then here's some of my favorites is asthma cigarettes. So really until the 1980s, they didn't know how bad cigarettes affected you. So you could take asthma cigarettes to cure your asthma. It cures your asthma, but then it kills you. And then also, this is really fun, is cocaine cures dandruff. And cocaine, by the way, was really well used for a long time for a pain medication, such as these toothache drops. And what happened is all this fake advertising and things like that. This is also where, if you want to write down, is the snake oil. That's what you're seeing right here, which is where people were selling goods saying that they did all these mysterious things, but they have to support that and back that claim. And that Pure Food and Drug Act continues until today. Same with the Meat Inspection Act. But for example, there was a couple years ago that somebody sued, I think it was Capri Sun, because Capri Sun said they had real juice, and it wasn't real juice, it was manufactured flavoring. And they lost, and it's based on this Pure Food and Drug Act. Whatever you eat, they have to say exactly what's in it, and they can't make any exasperating claims. Now, another thing they did as well is the advocacy to protect consumers from dangerous and injustice and things like that. The National Consumer League is not as influential back then, but it is really influential now. This is where you get recall alerts, for example. So if anything is recalled because it's unsafe, it's through this league, and trying to make sure that the consumer is getting good products. So now we're going to head into political machines, which if you want to, again, if there's boxes that I would like 1000% know, I would know prohibition. That one's really, really important. I would know African American rights. I would know the muckrakers and the political machines, because the political machines comes a lot when you talk about immigration. We were going to do immigration before, but we couldn't do it. So anyways, let's talk about political machines. And this is all, if you want to put above this, the HC of this is all going to be immigration. So Lincoln Steffens, he's a muckraker, and he's going to come up with this book, and it's called The Shame of the Cities. And the whole goal of The Shame of the Cities is to expose corrupt alliances between political machines and the government. So what is a political machine? Well, what happened is a political machine is going to be an organization that is controlled by a single boss that wielded enormous power over the entire government. So where it says often, so on your blank, you can just go ahead and put often immigrants, which works completely fine. And these political machines were basically chosen people, specifically, if you will, highlight of the Democratic Party, that would, in particular, attempt to be able to gain political power through the use of patronage. So if you want to also highlight patronage. So basically what that meant is the political party would choose somebody that they want to be the next whatever. Then what they would do is they would go to different people and they would say, if you vote for this person, I will give you this. And they specifically targeted immigrants in this. in order to be able to gain jobs and different things like that, especially jobs if you want to circle that, as well as money. And this became so strong where immigrants and people were selecting it that for almost 40 years, the entire thing of New York City was controlled by the Democrats, mostly because they had hand-selected who they wanted and also convinced immigrants, especially if you want to highlight the Irish, in order to be able to do this. And so what happens is, and by the way, all of these notes are actually on your immigration notes, so that's why it's a little bit different here, is because we were going to do this for immigration. Now, what happens with these political machines is you have one person that controls everything, and everything is hand-selected. So you vote for who they tell you to vote so that you can get several different benefits. Now, basically, here's how it works. You had whoever your boss was, okay? Your boss tells you who to vote for. You vote for that person, and they come into office, and oftentimes people wouldn't even know anything about them. In return, that person would then give various contracts, money, patronage to different people, which would then benefit you individually. And so these bosses were extremely beneficial, and if you didn't vote the way that the boss told you, then you actually would oftentimes be fired, you would be expelled, and dispelled from your general community. So what you're seeing right here is you're seeing the line-in is tackling Lady Liberty due to the ballot. Now, one of the persons that tried to expose this was a guy named Thomas Nast, and he wanted to expose this idea that the government was literally just being controlled by the Democratic Party and people who had chosen what they were going to do. Now, Thomas Nast, you actually know for another reason. The modern-day Santa Claus was drawn by Thomas Nast originally. So the image of like the big puffy suit and the big fat belly, that was created by Thomas Nast. He was campaigned by the Macy's Corporation to make people buy more Christmas stuff, and it worked. So he actually started to create political cartoons. He actually created the very famous political cartoon here where he designated the Democrats as a donkey, and then he designated the Republicans as an elephant, and we've kept these symbols up until today. Well, he starts to make political cartoons about this guy named Boss Tweed, and if you want to highlight Boss Tweed is going to be Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. So Tammany Hall is the organization, the boss itself is Boss Tweed, and I would highlight Tammany Hall too. Is that what happens is that Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall are going to be the controllers, and he starts to create these images. You can see right here he's controlled by money, and then over here the counting there is strength, but he's choosing what you're going to be doing at the ballot box. And so what happened is eventually political machines gets banned, but again, political machines specifically, so as a quick summary, it massively assisted immigrants. Immigrants got jobs, patronage, things like that, but this is not necessarily a good thing because this is all just corruption. So it's just government corruption of choosing your own people, and this lasted until eventually they banned the use of political machines. So now let's head into government reform. So governments are going to attempt to be changed and adjusted at this time, and one of the major concerns again was things like the spoil system and political machines. How do we know that the people we're voting for are actually democracy, or are people just selecting who we should vote for? And so they did this in a couple of ways. Now, you're going to need to write these underneath the government reform. This one in particular, because I forgot to add it, is what's called the secret ballot. So one of the first things that they're going to do is to create a secret ballot. Originally, newspapers, especially political machine newspapers, would post what everybody voted for and who they voted for. That was a great way to ostracize those that didn't listen to the political bosses. So now there was a secret ballot where now nobody can know that, and it's against the law, and we continue that up until today. Another thing that they did as well is what's called an initiative. So initiative is where you're going to propose a new law to go into actual law. And anybody can start an initiative. All they have to do is propose a law. They have to get a certain amount of signatures to have it be put on the ballot or go in front of Congress. Thank you so much. Have a good weekend. And so, for example, a few years ago, there was an elementary school up in Ogden that wanted to propose to have a brand new state tree. They had done all this research and they said this needs to be the state tree. They created an initiative, they got their signatures, it went in front of Congress in Utah, and it became a new state tree. So anybody can initiate a law. There's actually an initiative going in right now, which isn't technically an initiative, but there's a big thing about Sean Reyes, and should he no longer be our Attorney General. Right now they're getting signatures in a petition. It's not technically an initiative, but they do have a right to bring it up in front of Congress. One of my favorite examples of an initiative is you can do initiatives at the national level. One of the rules is there's a thing called, I think it's petition.whitehouse.gov. If you get over 100,000 valid voters to sign it, it has to go in front of Congress. A couple of years, 10 years ago, Justin Bieber was flying back from Canada. He is Canadian, and he decided that he was going to smoke quite a bit of marijuana. While he was flying, it actually ended up partially intoxicating the pilots, and it became a safety issue. And so there was a big petition to deport him, and it had to go in front of Congress because it got over 400,000 signatures. Another thing that you can do too is what's called a referendum, and a referendum is a way to reject or veto a law by population. This is a really fun way for the community to change their mind and say, we don't want this referendum. So let me give you an example. You might have heard of this mall. It's in Holiday. Just yesterday I was driving to the main Holiday. You drive right past it. Of course, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it looks like this today. And it's been sitting pretty vacant for quite a long period of time. Well, there was a company that wanted to come in and create this massive shopping center, as well as a lot of high-density apartments. Well, the community in Holiday was not happy of this, and they wanted to get rid of it. So instead what they did is they created a referendum. They got enough signatures to have it put onto the ballot. It became this huge thing. It went up to the Supreme Court of Utah, who ended up saying that the referendum was valid. They voted on it. It was extremely close. And then I think, if I remember correctly, what ended up happening is that they did veto the project. However, they went back to negotiations. They found a new way, and I don't think anything's been published, but yesterday when I drove by, it said future site of, and it was this company, so I guess they came up with an agreement of how they were going to handle that. A couple of years ago, last year, there was a big tax bill that was a tax referendum. They passed a big tax bill, and then what ended up happening is that there was a big referendum. It went on the bill, and the people of Utah rejected it, and they had to redo their tax reform. Another example that we do not have in Utah, but we do have in other states, is what is called a recall. This is where you remove somebody from office and it's not impeachment. So the Sean Reyes thing, they're trying to say impeachment, but we've never really had that in Utah. But a recall is something that does happen in several other states. So about, 7-8 years ago, in California, there was a really big incident called the Stanford Rapist Incident. And basically what happened is that at Stanford University, there was a swimmer that ended up sexually assaulting a female. It was seen by a lot of people. I think he ended up pleading guilty to it. Well, what happened is that they went in front of the judge, who it was recommended 5 to 15 years or something like that, and the judge gave him 3 months with time served, and he was released after, I think, 2 years in jail. The community was extremely unimpressed with this and not happy. They voted, they put it on the ballot, and enough people voted to recall the official. Right now, it's interesting because I'm a big Disney fan, as you guys know, and there's a whole bunch of talk about how California is dealing with Disneyland and stuff like that. And there's this huge push to recall the governor over everything happening in California. Now, I wouldn't say huge push because I don't think it would actually vote through, and it hasn't been put on the ballot. But just something to think about. And we don't have this here in Utah, by the way. We can only recall judges in Utah. So what's going to happen, too, is that another government reform is the direct election of senators and members of the House of Representatives. Originally, the original idea was that it wasn't an election. You didn't elect your senators or representatives. Instead, your state governor did that, or the state house or whatever. But like we said, with political machines, so a great HC of this would be the political machines, had said who was basically going to go. And so now it's a direct election, which allows for more democracy. So all of those, you can even put next to this, know the difference. A lot of people get referendum and recall mixed up, or initiative and referendum as well, and the difference. So initiative is suggesting a law, while referendum is changing or vetoing a law. Now, at the same time, we're going to have several different constitutional amendments that are going to come out. So I would know the difference of each of these. The 18th and 19th are pretty easy, and the 16th and 17th are a little bit trickier. The 16th Amendment, you can go ahead and highlight the word income tax, because it's going to go ahead and establish that. And then also the 17th Amendment, which we've already talked about, is the direct election. The 18th and 19th Amendment we're going to talk about later, but you can go ahead and pause. Oh, I guess you don't have to fill in the blank. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, not right now. Now, business reform is going to happen to try to be able to improve various businesses and the way that they practice. One of these most important, if you want to star this term, is what is called Taylorism. And many of you guys actually have to deal with Taylorism, and you don't even know it. So Taylorism is the idea where you are going to take scientific reasoning to improve businesses. So this is the idea of basically using science to improve things, and you can also put next to this is, if you will put next to Taylorism the word scientific management. Those two terms are ones that you will hear interchangeably. And it's the idea of using science and ideas in order to be able to improve. So let me give you an example really quickly. I want you to go ahead and watch this video, and I want you to think, how did they use science? How did they adjust things in order to be able to improve McDonald's? And this is from a movie called The Founders. It's all about McDonald's and how it was originated. I want you to think, what did they do to try to speed up and quicken up McDonald's? So go ahead and pause it really quickly, and I think I'm going to have like a link, and go ahead and watch that. So if you watch that link, let's talk about a couple things that you might have seen. Notice at the beginning when they first created their drawing of McDonald's, everybody was bumping into. It wasn't very scientific, and it slowed them down. They couldn't do it efficiently. Then they started to rearrange things, and they really worked on the science of rearranging to make it work. And eventually they have the McDonald's that you know today. That's scientific management. Scientific management is the idea of taking science and applying it to the business world. And if you want to go ahead and put next to this, this is all about efficiency. How fast can you get these done, and how can you use science to do that? A really great example is an axe. And I had a picture, but I can't find it. So what they originally did with the axe is to be able to make it so that it was the most, so to be able to make it the most scientific in how to be able to use an axe more efficiently, what they did is they took an axe and they had a guy, multiple guys, swing axes, and they took pictures over and over again of how they swung an axe. And what they realized is that the way that you swung the axe, there was different levels of efficiency. So they figured out that if you pull it back and bring it around and then chop it down in more of a up and down motion, it was more efficient than simply axing at the side. And that's how the modern day thing is today. The same thing it was with hammering. They took a whole bunch of people that were hammering, and they saw people that were like tapping like this, and they found it to be more efficient if you cock it back and you hit it. And that's scientific management. So for example, when we think about our stuff here at Skyline, an example of Taylorism at Skyline would be when we originally started with all the arrows in the ground, right? They figured out the best way to be able to create the arrows to make it the easiest to get from class to class, and that's an example of scientific management. So if you ever read any document that talks about using science to adjust their business practices or using sound judgment to adjust business practices, that's all with Taylorism. Oops. Now, Florence Kelly is somebody that you might see more for child and labor laws. She was heavily in influencing the creation of various laws to protect child and female laborers. The FTC is one that we've already talked about previously, but that's the Antitrust Commission. So when I gave you that example, I don't remember if I did it for the distance learner, but Fortnite, for example, is currently using the FTC to try to downgrade the App Store, for instance. And the Children's Bureau in particular focused on child labor. Now, if you want to put next to child labor a guy named Lewis Hine, that's Lewis, Lewis, space Hine, Hine. Now, Lewis Hine was a photographer, and he really wanted to expose child labor. And so what he did is he took all these different pictures of child laborers in the United States and tried to expose these child labor issues and really tried to focus on why you should get rid of these. And these images became iconic of the child labor era and really exposed a lot of people to what child labor was like and how dangerous it was. For example, these are the bobbin boys. So what a bobbin boy's job was that you had these looms and they took their feet and they pushed it back and forth to move the looms. And then about every 30 seconds, the looms would open and they would have to stick their fingers in, adjust the bobbins, and pull it out. And if they didn't pull it out in time, their fingers were chopped off. If they notice that they're not wearing shoes so that they can get a better grip, and if you slipped, your foot got cut off. There was a really gruesome one, of this girl who was doing this, and you'll notice a lot of these girls, for example, will have their hairs up. Part of the reason why, and this is also a bobbin girl, is that their hairs would get stuck into the loom machine and then scalp them off from this as well. And by the way, I just want to point out, pictures like this, for example, this kid is only 5 years old that was working there. A lot of kids started to work between 5 and 6 years old. So let's get to our very last section. Okay, so let's go ahead and flip to our last section for today. So we're going to talk about my favorite president in American history, which is a guy named Theodore Roosevelt. If you actually look on presidential ranking systems, oftentimes they rank Theodore Roosevelt as usually the third most popular president in American history. Abraham Lincoln is almost always number one, with George Washington is number two. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is the 26th president, and he is super iconic because he was the progressive president. He wanted to advocate for change. Now, interesting fact, by the way, he ends up becoming the governor of New York. And while he was the governor of New York, I gave the example, for instance, of the tenement laws and how they attempted to change that. He eventually became the police chief. There's a show called Blue Bloods, and in the show, they actually have a picture of Teddy Roosevelt on the wall. Well, when he's the governor of New York, people hated him in New York because he was too progressive. He was against the political machines, and he was against the corruption. And so to get rid of him, they had a great idea. They are going to designate him and say that you should instead become the vice president to William McKinley. And you might say, well, why would he become the vice president? Really, up until the 1950s, the vice president was really ceremonial. Oftentimes, it was the opposite political party to try to make political compromise. But really, to get rid of somebody, you just got rid of somebody with making them the vice president because they really didn't have any power. Unfortunately, McKinley gets shot and killed, which means who's the president? That's right, Teddy Roosevelt, who also becomes our youngest president in American history, and that continues up until today. And he becomes the president, and he's the progressive president. He's going to make all the progress in the United States and really push through and advocate for this change. Interesting fact as well, by the way, he is like the super tough guy. He actually was a boxing champion. To give you some idea of Teddy Roosevelt in your head, he was a boxing champion in the Navy, extremely smart. And while he was president, he actually had a private boxing ring at the White House, and there was a famous incident where diplomats would come and they would box him, and one time a diplomat came and boxed him and punched him in the eye and made him blind in one of his eyes, and he said he never regretted it. He was just a bad A kind of a guy. And one of the things he really advocated for was this thing called the bully pulpit. So if you read this, it says, it is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people and to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid it. Notice he's saying really the power of the president is to be the steward of the people. He has the right to do whatever he needs to do to demand betterness for the people of America. And this is what is known as the bully pulpit, which is, if you want to highlight, it's a really good idea. The bully pulpit is the idea that he can influence media, shape legislation, do whatever he wants. I would say the most similar bully pulpit would probably be President Obama. President Obama was very well known for going in front of the media. He was on Saturday Night Live all the time. He was always on late night talk shows as president, and he really was focused on trying to use the media to shape legislation and convince others of how they should believe. Now, he had this thing known as the square deal, if you want to go ahead and star. We're going to talk about most of the square deal today, excluding next class for the supplemental lecture. You'll do the rest. And the square deal had 3 C's. Conservation of natural resources, that's what we're going to talk about in the supplemental lecture, which is so sad because it's one of my favorites. The creation of controls and regulations for corporations, we're just about to do that. And consumer protection programs, and if you want to put consumer protection programs, if you remember back with the section in here entitled Consumer Reform, so if you go back to the section on consumer reform and about the Meat Inspection Act, that's all Teddy Roosevelt. And then we'll do natural resources later, and then the corporations we're just about to talk about right now. So let's remind ourselves of trusts. Trusts are people that are going to own all the parts of a business. The Standard Oil Trust is a great example of this. By the year 1900, 4/5 of all the industry in the United States was controlled by various trusts. And people were upset, and they were worried that these people were taking over. These were the robber barons of the time period, making a whole bunch of money while the little guy suffers. So let me give you an example to remind you just a little bit about why trusts are a bad thing and really why it's bad for the consumer. So I am a gamer. I love Xbox. Xbox is definitely my platform I like to play on. So let's pretend that in this case, an Xbox costs, and I don't know how much it really costs. We're going to say it costs $100 to produce, manufacture, I buy it into my store, and then I go to sell it to be able to make my profit. Well, let's think of an imagination. Let's pretend that, remember that Xbox costs $100 to make, that there is a cute little couple named Markham and Miss Ray, and they want to be able to make a video game store, and it's their dream to make a video game store. And so they make a video game store called the Best Game Store. And they want to be able to make some money, and if you know anything about upcharging and things like that on products, they are going to sell an Xbox for $300, about a $200 profit, but remember, you're having to pay, your employees, electric bills, and things like that. And it's a pretty reasonable price. Well, then we're going to have our robber barons, our bad industrialists that want to come in as a trust. And we're going to pretend that this trust comes in and these are the bad guys of our community. And they want to be able to also make some money, so they make their own gaming trust. And their gaming trust is going to be called the Awesome Sauce Gaming Company. And this is a trust and a monopoly, and these guys are our robber barons who are going to hurt poor little The Best Game Store and take away all their money. So what are they going to do? They're going to sell Xboxen, for $105. Now, this is only a $5 profit, and you might say, well, they could never sustain themselves. That's not the point of a trust. The point of the trust is to do what's ever necessary to do the smallest amount in order to be able to get all the competition gone, buy them out, and own most of the industry. So what's going to happen here is they sell for $105. Now think of the Best Game Store. Can they afford that? No, they can't, and eventually they go out of business, because if I'm choosing two different places, am I going to buy the Xbox for $300 or $105? Well, now that they've done this and now that this game store is closed, notice now that they now don't have any competition. So what are they going to do to their price? They're going to jack it up to $1,000 in Xbox. That's how a trust and a monopoly works, and why trust and monopolies are so bad. So this is when he's going to come in and he's going to make sure that all this gets destroyed. He is the muckraker and he is the progressive president. I just want to remind you, by the way, if you guys remember that political cartoon of the guy raking the muck, that was Teddy Roosevelt. So he's going to come in and he's going to be the major thing, which is the trust buster, if you want to go ahead and star that. The trust buster is going to be the guy that's going to come in and he is going to stop all these trusts from being so bad. Notice, for example, that he comes in, you can see he's taming all the trusts right here, and he is the trust buster here. We'll talk about the stick later. It's actually part of another thing that we're going to learn about with Teddy Roosevelt. A great example of this is the Pennsylvania coal strike. So you had all these child laborers who were working in Pennsylvania. We actually saw a picture of them earlier. And during this coal strike, they were trying to show the bad labor conditions for children and how they were dying of cancer at like 12 years old. And so what happens is that he takes over and he says, I'm going to take over the handling of the trusts and of this labor strike. And so he comes in, he breaks up the coal strike and improves working conditions for all. And that's where you're seeing this of killing the coal strike right here of Roosevelt's biggest game. Another thing that he really expanded is that you can see it's passed in 1883, but he really makes it known federally during his presidency. And you can also put next to Teddy Roosevelt, this is going to be 1900 to 1908 is going to be his time era. And the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883 is going to remove the spoils system and prohibit government workers from making political contributions. And it was basically a way to be able to prevent all this bad things from happening in the government. Now, one of his biggest, most successful things that he's going to do is the Sherman Antitrust Act, and you can go ahead and star that. That's really his biggest thing, and it's going to ban monopolies in the United States. That's the same one that we talked about when we talked about Fortnite and Apple that people are bringing up in terms of trusts. The Clayton Antitrust Act comes a little bit later, which pervades price discrimination, which basically means they can't price things up and down. For instance, that's price gouging, which you might have seen during COVID where people jacked up the price of everything. You can't do that according to this act. So we're going to go ahead and stop right there. That was your lecture for today. Way to hang on. And don't forget, this is very, very important stuff. Super important. Thanks.